The training field went silent the moment Commander Habel raised his sword toward a boy nobody respected. Third Prince Kalian stood in the mud, thin as a broken branch, while 40 knights watched their commander mock him in front of the entire squad. Habel called him a waste of royal blood. He said the palace would be better off if the boy stopped breathing altogether. The knights laughed. Nobody expected what came next. Kalian bent down, picked up a snap twig from the dirt, and told Habel to attack him properly this time. The commander's blade came down in a blur meant to end the joke fast. It never landed. Somehow the twig caught the flat of the sword, twisted once, and sent the weapon flying out of Habel's grip. It landed point first in the mud, 10 feet away, still shaking from the impact. For a long moment nobody moved. Habel stared at his empty hand like it belonged to someone else. This was the boy the entire court called the family's embarrassment. A frail third prince who fainted after light exercise, who bled from the nose for no reason, who had never once shown a shred of magic or swordsmanship in 16 years of life. And yet he had just disarmed a royal knight commander with a piece of wood, without so much as raising his voice. What none of them knew was that the body kneeling in that mud belonged to someone who had already died once. His name had been Baron, once, king of a nation called Sacriia, a ruler who had commanded armies, broken sieges, and burned cities when mercy stopped being useful. In his old life, he had watched his own capital collapse under Kyus siege engines. He remembered the smell of it. He remembered his best soldiers falling one by one while he screamed orders nobody could follow anymore. He remembered a mage from Kyus driving a spear of ice through his chest at the base of the palace steps, right where the throne room doors used to stand. Death had felt like falling through cold water. Then he had woken up 10 years earlier, inside the body of a sickly teenage prince belonging to the very empire that destroyed him. Kyus, the enemy nation, now his own. He hadn't understood it at first. For weeks he had simply tried to survive inside a body that betrayed him constantly, one that lost weight no matter how much he ate, one that collapsed if he walked too far, one that occasionally bled from the nose during breakfast for no visible reason. The palace physicians had no answers. His own father barely looked at him. Everyone assumed Prince Kalian was simply weak, the way a lame horse is simply lame, and left it there. Habel had assumed exactly that. He learned otherwise in front of 40 witnesses. That evening, word of the incident spread through the palace faster than any royal decree. Servants whispered it in the kitchens. Guards repeated it at the gates. By the time it reached the royal breakfast hall the next morning, it had already been reduced to a rumor nobody quite believed. Prince Planche, the eldest son and heir apparent, certainly didn't believe it. He arrived to breakfast already drunk, swaying slightly as he dropped into his chair across from Kalian. He'd heard the story from a guard and decided it was nonsense. He drew a hunting knife from his belt without warning and threw it. The blade spun end over end toward Kalian's skull, fast enough that any of the servants standing nearby would have had no time to react. Kalian's hand came up almost lazily and closed around the handle an inch from his own face. He set it down beside his plate, blade pointed away from himself, and kept eating. Planche stared at his own hand, as if it had failed him twice in one day, by proxy. Queen Celis watched from the head of the table with an expression that gave away nothing. She was Kalian's stepmother, mother to Planche, and the most dangerous person in the palace, though almost nobody outside her small circle understood how dangerous. She said nothing about the knife. She simply poured more tea into Kalian's cup with her own hand, the way she did every single morning, and told him to drink before it went cold. He did. He always did. He had no idea yet what that tea was costing him. That night, alone in his chambers, Kalian sat with his eyes closed and did something he had been too weak to attempt in weeks. He turned his attention inward, past the constant ache in his chest, and searched for whatever remained of his old power. What he found surprised him. 3 mana circles, fully formed, humming quietly around his heart like sleeping embers. A talent most mages would kill for, wasted on a body everyone had already written off as broken. But something else sat beneath those circles, and it explained everything. A slow poison, old and deeply embedded, feeding on his body a little more every single day. It wasn't strong enough to kill quickly. It was designed to wear him down instead, year after year, until his death looked like nothing more than a sickly prince finally succumbing to a weak constitution nobody would question. He thought of the tea. He thought of the queen's hand pouring it, every morning, without fail. The next breakfast, he didn't drink it right away. He looked at Queen Celis across the table and told her, calmly, that he'd been feeling stronger lately. He said it like a passing comment about the weather. He watched her face for exactly one heartbeat before she smiled and asked if the tea agreed with him. It was a small thing, a single sentence, but something shifted in the air between them, and both of them knew it. He drank the tea anyway. He needed her to believe nothing had changed, at least for now. Getting real answers meant leaving the palace, and leaving the palace meant getting past guards who watched him specifically because he was too fragile to be trusted outside the walls alone. So 3 days later, during the chaos of preparations for the king's birthday celebration, Kalian slipped out through the side stables. There was a horse there nobody could ride, a black stallion that had thrown 4 different grooms in a single week and put one of them in the infirmary. Kalian walked up to it, placed a hand flat against its neck, and spoke to it in a low, steady voice until it stopped pulling against the rope. Within minutes, he was riding it out through a service gate the guards rarely watched, heading toward the outer fortress district where rumor placed a rogue mage named Ellen. His butler noticed him missing almost immediately. Soyeon had served Kalian for 2 years, quiet and careful in everything he did, the kind of servant who remembered exactly how his prince liked his boots polished and never needed to be told twice. When palace guards began asking questions about the prince's whereabouts, Soyeon did something nobody expected. He calmly informed them that Prince Kalian had asked him to arrange a private matter and that further questions should be directed to him personally, not repeated up the chain. The guards backed off. Nobody argued with Soyeon when he used that particular tone. What none of the guards knew, and what Kalian himself hadn't confirmed yet, was that Soyeon wasn't a common servant at all. He was the eldest son of Duke Siegfried, one of the most powerful noble houses in Kyus, working inside the palace under a false name for reasons even he hadn't fully explained. He had chosen to serve Kalian specifically, and he protected that secret as carefully as he protected his prince. Kalian found Master Ellen exactly where the rumors placed him, in a run-down cottage on the fortress district's edge, surrounded by half-finished alchemical equipment and the smell of burnt herbs. Ellen was a 7th Circle mage who had walked away from royal service decades earlier and wanted nothing to do with palace politics ever again. He made that very clear the moment Kalian introduced himself. Then he actually examined the prince, and his expression changed completely. He found 3 mana circles where the medical reports insisted there should be none. He found a poison lodged deep in the boy's system, old enough that it had likely been there for years, strong enough that it explained every symptom the physicians had failed to diagnose. He asked, quietly, who had been serving Kalian his tea every morning since childhood. Kalian told him. Ellen sat back in his chair for a long moment, saying nothing. Then he stood, walked to a locked cabinet, and pulled out a small vial of pale liquid. He said it wouldn't cure the poison, only slow its damage enough to buy time, and that real answers would require watching the boy grow stronger under careful supervision. He offered to become that supervision. It wasn't kindness driving him. Ellen had no love for the royal family and said so plainly. What he had was curiosity, and beneath the curiosity, the beginning of something closer to respect. A boy with a body wrecked by years of poison had somehow taught himself to sense his own mana circles without any formal training at all. That alone was worth investigating. Kalian accepted the offer and asked for one more thing. He wanted the alliance kept quiet, invisible to the palace, invisible to the queen especially. Ellen agreed easily. He'd been avoiding palace attention for 20 years. One more secret changed nothing for him. Riding back toward the palace that night, Kalian allowed himself a rare moment of something like relief. He had allies now, even if they numbered only 2. He had confirmation of the poison, confirmation of his hidden strength, and a clearer picture of the war being waged against him one teacup at a time. He also had a growing list of enemies who had no idea what they were dealing with. That blindness would not last forever. Queen Celis believed her plan was invisible, built slowly enough that nobody would ever trace it back to her. Marquis Evan Brison, her father, believed his family's influence over the throne was untouchable. Commander Habel had already learned once what happened when he underestimated the boy everyone dismissed. Others would learn it soon, in far worse ways. Somewhere beneath the palace's polished floors and quiet hallways, a king who had already died once was rebuilding himself piece by piece, using a decade he never expected to get. He intended to use every day of it. The following week brought a small disaster that ended up mattering more than anyone expected. A wealthy merchant noble named Baron Malir had rented out a section of the marketplace square for a private gathering, complete with an enormous chandelier suspended above the dining area by old rope that hadn't been inspected in years. Kalian, passing through the market on Ellen's orders to gather rare herbs, noticed the rope fraying at one specific point nobody else had looked twice at. He said nothing dramatic. He simply walked over, pointed it out to the nearest steward, and insisted it be checked before the event began. It was checked. It nearly snapped under a single tug. Baron Malir, once he understood how close he had come to losing half his guests to a falling chandelier, sought Kalian out personally. He wasn't a powerful noble by palace standards, but he controlled a wide trade network in diamonds and horses, and he made it clear, quietly and sincerely, that his loyalty now belonged to whoever had just saved his life. Kalian accepted the offer without hesitation. Every ally counted, even the ones who traded in horses instead of swords. Not every problem could be solved with a warning, though. Some required going somewhere far darker. Kalian had heard whispers of an underground fighting ring operating beneath the capital's poorer district, the kind of place city guards were paid to ignore. He went there under a false name, calling himself Red Swan, and paid an old information broker, known only as White Eagle, for details on a specific gladiator fighting under forced conditions. The gladiator's name was Kiri. In his old life, Kiri had been Kalian's most loyal knight, a man who had died protecting him during the final siege of Sacriia. Finding him alive, enslaved, and fighting for the entertainment of men who saw him as property hit harder than Kalian expected. He bet everything he had on Kiri's next match, shouted tactical advice from the crowd that turned an impossible fight into a decisive win, and then refused to leave without both Kiri and his silent, half-elf sister Hina. The mobsters running the ring didn't want to let either of them go. Kalian didn't give them a choice. A single aura strike, controlled but unmistakably lethal in what it could have done, ended the argument before it started. He walked out with both siblings that same night, and Kiri, disoriented by a freedom he hadn't dared to hope for, asked why a stranger would spend a fortune on a slave he'd never met. Kalian told him only that he'd seen something worth saving. The rest of that truth would have to wait. Back at the palace, the tea kept coming every morning, and Kalian kept drinking it, playing a patient man in front of people who were anything but patient with him. Queen Celis watched him carefully now, searching for any sign that her secret had unraveled. She found none, because Kalian gave her none. He was already 3 steps ahead, gathering allies the queen didn't know existed, testing a strength she assumed had died in the cradle. Somewhere in the palace of Hessia, a poison meant to erase him quietly was instead buying him time to plan exactly how her own scheme would be turned back on her. Weeks passed, and Kalian's plan needed one more piece before he could move against the queen directly. He needed proof that would hold up even against a woman who had spent years covering her tracks. Master Ellen provided it, almost by accident. During one of their private training sessions in the Fortress District, Ellen mentioned a rare plant the Mages Association kept for detecting toxins, a flowering vine that reacted to poison by releasing a faint glowing pollen visible only at night. He mentioned it as a passing curiosity. Kalian asked him to acquire one immediately. Ellen didn't ask why. He simply delivered the plant 3 days later, wrapped carefully in cloth, warning Kalian that the reaction only worked once before the flower wilted for good. That gave him a single chance. The next morning, Kalian sat through breakfast as usual, accepted his tea from the queen's own hand as usual, and waited until she left the hall before pouring most of it onto the plant hidden beneath his sleeve. He carried the vine back to his chambers, set it by the window, and watched through the evening as faint golden pollen began drifting from its petals, thin as smoke, moving steadily in one direction. It led, without any ambiguity, straight toward the private wing of the Palace of Hessia, the queen's own chambers. He had his answer. What he needed now was a way to make that answer public without giving Celis room to deny it, delay it, or bury it under palace politics the way she had buried every other threat to her position for years. He decided the birthday banquet would be the place to do it. It was a reckless plan, and Ellen told him so bluntly when Kalian explained it. Master Ellen argued that quiet exposure, delivered through proper channels, carried far less risk than confronting a woman capable of ordering assassinations from behind a smile. Kalian listened to every objection and agreed with most of them. Then he explained why quiet exposure wouldn't work. Celis had spent a decade making Kalian's decline look natural. A quiet accusation, without undeniable proof in front of witnesses who mattered, would simply vanish the way every other whisper about her had vanished. He needed something loud, something that couldn't be explained away by morning. He needed to nearly die in front of the entire court. The banquet arrived on a clear evening, the great hall lit by hundreds of candles. Nobles from every major house gathered to celebrate King Roma's birthday, with wine and performance and careful political maneuvering disguised as small talk. Kalian moved through the crowd calmly, greeting people he barely tolerated, watching Queen Celis hold court near the head table with practiced warmth. When the moment came, he made sure she was close enough to see everything. He'd prepared a second poison beforehand, sourced quietly through Ellen from an old alchemist who owed him a debt, something fast-acting on the heart, but survivable if treated within minutes by the right hands. He drank it disguised in a cup of wine, waited until the hall had settled into its usual rhythm of laughter and idle conversation, then walked directly toward the queen and told her, in a voice pitched just loud enough for the nearest tables to hear, that he knew exactly what she put in his morning tea. Her expression cracked for less than a second. It was enough. She denied it immediately, calling the accusation the delusion of a sickly boy who had clearly had too much wine. But Kalian kept speaking, calm and precise, laying out details about the tea, about years of symptoms nobody could otherwise explain, about a mother, Queen Aisha, who had died under circumstances everyone had been told to stop asking about. Celis's composure slipped further with each sentence. She told him, quietly enough that only those closest could hear, that his mother had been a fool who never understood her place, and that Kalian would learn the same lesson eventually. It was the closest thing to a confession the court would get. Then his own poison caught up with him, right on schedule. His legs gave out first. The room's noise dropped to a horrified silence as Kalian collapsed onto the marble floor, his heart stuttering under the combined weight of years of slow poisoning and the fast-acting toxin he'd swallowed deliberately minutes earlier. Blood came from his nose, then from the corner of his mouth. Somewhere above him, King Roma finally rose from his seat, his face for once showing something other than indifference. Master Ellen reached him within seconds, having stayed close all evening exactly for this. He forced healing energy into Kalian's chest, buying time rather than curing anything, shouting for anyone who could offer real medical help. That help came from an unexpected direction. Hina had been standing near the edge of the hall with Kiri, both of them quietly present as part of Kalian's small household staff now. She pushed through the crowd before anyone could stop her, dropped to her knees beside him, and pressed both hands flat against his chest. Her magic wasn't loud or dramatic. It moved through him slow and green, nature-born healing that most court mages would have dismissed as too gentle to matter in a crisis like this. It mattered enough. Combined with Ellen's pain-blocking spell work, it kept Kalian's heart beating through the worst of it, buying the minutes his body needed to survive its own gamble. He didn't lose consciousness completely, though everything blurred at the edges. He remembers, faintly, King Roma's voice demanding answers, and Queen Celis's voice rising in pitch as she tried to control a situation that had already slipped entirely out of her hands. The court had seen too much to let this disappear quietly. By morning, word of the collapse had spread through the capital faster than any royal announcement could contain. Nobles whispered about poison in the palace. Servants whispered about the queen's tea. Within 2 days, small crowds had gathered outside the palace gates, uneasy and angry, demanding answers about a prince who had nearly died in front of witnesses from every noble house in the kingdom. Queen Celis couldn't silence a rumor that size. She could only try to contain the damage. Kalian, still weak but conscious, used the chaos exactly as he'd intended. He didn't demand her execution, not yet. He wasn't strong enough politically to survive that fight this early, and he knew it. Instead, through a carefully worded private meeting arranged by Soyan, he extracted something else from her. A binding magical contract, sealed with her own blood, surrendering control of her personal elite guard to him, under penalty of death should she ever break the agreement. She signed it. She had no better option available, not with the entire court watching her every move for the first time in years. It wasn't justice. It was leverage, cold and practical, exactly the kind of move Baron would have made as king. Kalian understood the difference between winning a moment and winning a war, and he intended to win the war. Soyan took the near-death badly, worse than anyone expected from someone usually so composed. He had personally carried Kalian's morning tea to his chambers nearly every day for 2 years, unaware of what it contained, unaware he'd been an unwitting tool in a decade-long poisoning. When he learned the full truth, something in him broke quietly, without the shouting or drama anyone might have expected from a lesser man. He found Kalian alone that evening, still recovering in bed, and simply apologized, not with excuses, not with explanations. He said he should have noticed something was wrong sooner, that he'd failed at the one job that mattered most, and that he understood if Kalian no longer wanted him serving in his chambers. Kalian told him to sit down and stop being an idiot. He explained, plainly, that Soyeon hadn't poisoned anyone. A woman with a decade of practice at hiding murder had simply been better at deception than a loyal servant had any reason to expect. He told Soyeon that trust wasn't something earned once and lost the moment circumstances turned ugly. It was something proven over time, and Soyeon had proven his 100 times over already. Soyeon didn't cry easily. That night he came close. He vowed, quietly and without any of his usual careful phrasing, that he would spend the rest of his life making sure nothing like this happened again. Kalian believed him completely. Some bonds didn't need grand declarations to be real. This one had already survived worse than most ever would. With the immediate crisis behind him, Kalian's recovery gave him time to think about what came next. Queen Celis was wounded but not destroyed. Her father, Marquis Evan Brisson, remained untouched, still commanding significant influence through back-channel deals and quiet threats against anyone who opposed his family's interests. And somewhere in the palace, Kalian's own royal obligations kept advancing regardless of poison plots or political warfare. Chief among them was the Rosalita ceremony, a mandatory rite of passage for royal heirs approaching adulthood, requiring a journey to the ancient cave of the goddess Sisfanian in the Siegfried family's outer territories. Missing it wasn't an option, not for a prince whose legitimacy already faced enough questions from a suspicious court. Ellen advised against the trip while Kalian was still weak. Kalian went anyway, 3 weeks later, once his strength had recovered enough to travel without collapsing halfway there. The road to Siegfried territory ran through several days of quiet countryside, escorted by a small guard contingent that included, much to Kalian's private amusement, Soyeon riding at his side under his true identity for the first time since Kalian had learned it. Duke Siegfried himself met them at the border of his lands, a towering man with the bearing of someone who had spent decades as the second strongest swordmaster on the continent. He studied Kalian for a long moment before asking for a sparring match. It wasn't a request most 16-year-old princes could survive, let alone win. Kalian agreed without hesitation. What followed left the Duke's personal guard staring in open disbelief as the frail prince everyone whispered about matched a legendary swordmaster blow for blow, cracking the old man's blade near the hilt and drawing a thin line of blood across his neck before the Duke finally called the match. Siegfried didn't look angry. He looked, for the first time in years according to his own men, genuinely impressed. He said little about it afterward, only that he understood now why his son had chosen to serve this particular prince in secret. Whatever silent judgment the Duke had been withholding about Soyeon's decision 2 years earlier seemed to resolve itself in that single exchange of blades. The cave of Sisfanian waited 3 days further into Siegfried territory, hidden deep within a mountain range locals avoided out of old superstition. Kalian entered alone, as tradition required, walking down a long tunnel lit only by strange, ancient light that seemed to come from the stone itself rather than any visible source. What waited at the bottom wasn't a statue or a shrine. It was the goddess herself, enormous and ancient, coiled in a form that resembled something between dragon and serpent, her presence filling the cavern with a weight Kalian felt in his chest before he even saw her clearly. She read his mind before he spoke a single word. She confirmed what Master Ellen had only theorized. Kalian's memories of his past life, his knowledge of the axis of time, and the regression that had brought him here, were real, and another goddess named Sorrenti was actively working to keep the deeper truth of that artifact hidden, even from Sisfanian herself. She told him plainly that his younger brother, Chase, had not been responsible for triggering the regression, contradicting an assumption Kalian hadn't even realized he'd been carrying. She offered no further explanation. Ancient beings rarely explain themselves fully, and Sisfanian was no exception. Kalian left the cave with more questions than answers, but also with something he hadn't expected, a strange sense of confirmation. He wasn't losing his mind. He wasn't imagining a past life to cope with a broken present. Something real had brought him back, and something else, some rival will hidden behind Sorrenti's silence, didn't want him understanding why. That mystery would have to wait. More immediate threats were already gathering on the road home. Count Grey Brisson, eldest son of Marquis Seven and heir to one of the kingdom's most influential noble houses, had been quietly furious since word of Kalian's confrontation with the queen reached his family estate. Grey blamed the prince for destabilizing an alliance his family had spent years building with the throne. When Kalian's small traveling party crossed paths with Grey's convoy on the road back toward the capital, the count made no effort to hide his contempt. He remained seated in his open carriage as Kalian approached, a deliberate insult toward a member of the royal family, and made a comment loud enough for both retinues to hear about weak princes who needed poison scandals to feel important. Kalian didn't raise his voice. He simply let a fraction of his aura pressure fill the space between them, cold and unmistakable, the kind of pressure only someone who had commanded armies could produce naturally. Grey's composure lasted only a few seconds under that weight. He rose from his seat, bowed lower than any count had bowed to a mere prince in living memory, and offered a stiff apology through gritted teeth. It wasn't respect, it was fear, and both of them knew the difference, but the outcome served Kalian's purposes exactly the same either way. It should have ended there. Grey's men made sure it didn't. Later that same evening, while the two traveling parties camped within sight of each other along the road, several of Grey's personal knights were caught attempting to assault Hina near the tree line, mistaking her quiet, mute nature for an easy target with no one watching. Kiri found them first. What followed wasn't gentle. Kiri, still carrying the rage of years spent as a slave with no power to protect anyone, least of all his own sister, made sure the knights responsible would never speak of the incident, or much else, again. Arson, the ice mage recently drawn into Kalian's growing circle through Ellen's connections, arrived moments later and reduced the knight's carriage to ash, as a message aimed squarely at Count Grey. Grey protested the violence toward his men the next morning. Kalian reminded him coldly exactly what his knights had attempted, and asked whether Grey wanted to explain that detail publicly instead. The count went quiet very fast. Kalian wasn't finished with him yet, though. Days later, on a quieter stretch of road closer to the capital, he ambushed Grey's carriage directly, dragging the count out by the throat with enough force to leave him gasping in the dirt before an audience of stunned guards too frightened to intervene. He choked a confession out of him there on the road, learning what he'd already suspected. Marquis Evan Bryson himself had ordered the roadside ambushes against royal mages that had been quietly plaguing Kalian's allies for weeks. Grey walked away from that encounter alive, but stripped permanently of his ability to channel aura, a punishment more humiliating to a swordmaster than death itself would have been. Back in the capital, Kalian secured one final piece before returning to the deeper game against the queen. He met privately with his older brother Planche, the same prince who had once thrown a knife at his head over breakfast, and learned the truth behind years of public drunkenness and cruelty. Planche's alcoholism had never been real. It had been a mask, carefully maintained since childhood, designed to make himself look too unstable and unreliable for Queen Celis to use as a political weapon against his own father. He'd been protecting himself the only way available to a prince without allies of his own, sacrificing his reputation rather than his freedom. Kalian offered him something Planche hadn't been offered in years, an actual alliance, built on mutual understanding instead of political convenience. Planche accepted, quietly, the closest thing to trust either brother had extended to anyone inside the palace walls in a very long time. Queen Celis, meanwhile, had run out of patience. The Valcon inauguration had been building for months, ever since King Roma finally approved Kalian's proposal to form an elite military unit built entirely from non-chanting mages, soldiers capable of casting spells through instinct and combat reflex rather than the slow, formal incantations most royal battalions relied on. It would answer directly to the crown, sidestepping the tangled loyalties that infected every other branch of the military. The king named Ellen its commanding officer, granting him the title of Count on the Spot. He handed strategic oversight of the old royal knight training facilities to Planche, formally acknowledging the alliance between the brothers for the first time in front of the full court. It was meant to be a triumph. Queen Celis intended to make it her final stand instead. She had spent the weeks since the banquet scandal rebuilding what little influence remained to her, working quietly through servants still loyal to her household, searching for one decisive move that could destroy Kalian's credibility before Valcon's formal ceremony cemented his position beyond her reach. What she settled on was crude but effective, a staged catastrophe she could pin on the very mages Kalian had just been given command over. She arranged for one of her most trusted maids to detonate a section of her own private apartments during the inauguration ceremony, timed precisely to draw attention away from the main hall at the moment Ellen's mages would be standing closest to the blast radius. The plan relied on chaos and assumption. A queen's chambers destroyed, mages nearby, conclusions drawn before anyone bothered checking the details. The explosion came right on schedule, a deep concussive boom that rattled windows across the eastern wing and sent smoke curling up over the palace rooftops in full view of the assembled court. Celis played her part perfectly, rushing from the hall in apparent horror, demanding to know how anyone could target her private chambers during her own husband's celebration. She hadn't accounted for one detail. Her own father had already decided to abandon her. Marquis Evan Breeson had watched his daughter's position crumble for weeks, with the cold calculation of a man who valued his house's survival over any single member of it. Gray's humiliation on the road, stripped of his aura in front of witnesses, had convinced him the family's alliance with the Queen had become a liability rather than an asset. When Kalian approached him quietly through an intermediary days before the ceremony, offering immunity from treason charges in exchange for testimony against Celis, Evan didn't hesitate long before agreeing. So when the Queen returned to the hall expecting shock and confusion to shield her accusation, she found Kalian waiting instead, standing calmly beside her own father. Evan spoke first, his voice carrying easily across the stunned silence of the hall. He detailed the poisoning, the years of concentrated toxin hidden in morning tea, the murder of Queen Aisha carried out on his daughter's orders over a decade earlier, and the staged explosion meant to frame the crown's own mages on the very day of their formal recognition. He held nothing back. A man protecting his house had no room left for loyalty to a daughter who'd already dragged that house to the edge of ruin. Celis's mask didn't just crack this time, it shattered completely. She stood in the center of the hall, surrounded by nobles who had spent years pretending not to notice her cruelty, and watched every carefully built alliance dissolve within a single conversation. King Roma, silent through most of it, finally spoke, his voice hollow with a kind of exhausted anger that came from realizing exactly how long he'd allowed himself not to see what was happening under his own roof. He ordered her guards removed. What happened next moved fast enough that few in the hall fully processed it until it was already over. Celis lunged, not toward the king, not toward her father who had just condemned her, but toward Kalian. A blade appeared in her hand from somewhere in her sleeve, driven by rage that had finally outrun whatever calculation once made her dangerous. She meant to end this the only way left available to her, taking the boy who'd unraveled a decade of careful murder down with her. Planche moved before anyone else in the hall could react. He threw himself between his mother and his brother, taking the blade meant for Kalian directly into his chest. The sound that came from the assembled nobles was somewhere between a gasp and a scream, dozens of voices overlapping as Planche staggered backward, blood already spreading dark across his tunic, his mother's knife still buried in him. Kalian's response came almost instantly, faster than conscious thought. An aura blade formed in his hand in a single fluid motion, and he cut across Celis's wrist before she could pull the knife free for a second strike. Her hand fell separately to the marble floor, still curled around nothing, severed clean at the joint. She screamed, a sound raw with pain and disbelief, staring at the stump where her hand used to be, as if her body had betrayed her the way her plans just had. Guards finally moved, restraining her as physicians rushed toward Planche, who remained conscious but bleeding heavily, his breathing shallow and uneven. Hina reached him within moments, her hands already glowing with the same quiet green light that had saved Kalian's life at the banquet weeks earlier. Between her healing and the frantic work of the court physicians, Planche's wound stabilized enough to keep him breathing, though it would be weeks before he stood on his own again. Queen Celis's trial happened with almost indecent speed. Evan's testimony, combined with the pollen trail evidence Kalian had gathered weeks earlier and the very public knife attack the entire court had just witnessed, left no room for the kind of political maneuvering that might have saved a lesser scandal. She was stripped of her title within days, condemned to the guillotine before the same nobles who had once bowed to her at every royal function. She showed no remorse at the execution, only bitterness, insisting to the very end that everything she'd done had been for her son's future. Planche, still recovering in his own chambers, refused to attend. He told Kalian privately that he'd already said everything he needed to say to their mother, on the floor of that hall, with a blade in his own chest instead of his brother's. With Celis gone, and the Brisson family's influence broken beyond immediate repair, the political landscape of the palace shifted more in a matter of weeks than it had in the previous decade combined. King Roma, forced to confront just how much cruelty had operated under his own roof unnoticed, began asking Kalian questions about the source of his sudden abilities. Questions that had been quietly ignored during the chaos of the Queen's downfall, but couldn't be avoided forever. Kalian answered carefully, leaning on the encounter with Sisfanian rather than the truth of his regression. He told his father a version of events where the goddess herself had recognized something dormant in his bloodline during the Rosalita ceremony, and chosen to awaken it early, a blessing rather than anything requiring deeper explanation. It wasn't entirely a lie. It simply left out the parts nobody in that hall was prepared to understand. Roma accepted the explanation without much scrutiny. A king who had just watched his wife executed for a decade of poisoning had little appetite left for questioning miracles that worked in his family's favor for once. Beneath the surface of these political victories, quieter business remained unfinished. Kiri, still burning with the particular fury of a man who had spent years enslaved by people who saw him as entertainment, requested permission to finish what had started the night Kalian first freed him from the underground fighting ring. He wanted to tear the entire operation down, not just the section that had held him. Kalian granted it without hesitation. On one condition: any guard who hadn't personally enslaved someone would be spared. Kiri agreed, though the distinction meant little relief for the men who actually ran the ring. Over the following 2 months, working with a small group of soldiers loaned quietly from Ellen's new Valcon unit, Kiri systematically dismantled the entire network, freeing dozens of enslaved fighters and leaving nothing behind for the Syndicate to rebuild from. He returned from that campaign changed in some small way nobody could quite name, lighter somehow, like a debt long overdue had finally been paid in full. Life in the palace, for the first time since Kalian's regression began, settled into something almost approaching normal. He spent mornings training with Ellen, afternoons managing the slow expansion of Valcon's ranks, and evenings in the company of the small, strange family he'd assembled around himself. Soyan still handled his chambers with the same quiet precision as always, though he no longer flinched at the mention of morning tea. Hina had taken to sneaking into the kitchens for extra portions of dessert, communicating her requests through increasingly elaborate hand signs that made even the sternest palace cooks smile despite themselves. Kiri, when not training or managing Valcon's newer recruits, had developed an odd fondness for teaching Hina card games with rules he adjusted constantly depending on who was winning. Even Planche, once he'd recovered enough to walk without support, began spending more time in Kalian's company than either brother had expected. He dropped the drunken act entirely now that its purpose had ended, revealing underneath it someone sharper and more observant than his old reputation ever suggested. The two princes, who had started this story with a thrown knife between them, found something resembling genuine trust in its place. Kalian allowed himself, cautiously, to believe the worst of the immediate danger had passed. He knew better than to believe it entirely, though. Prince Randall, the quiet second prince who spent nearly all his time cultivating an elaborate rose garden in isolation, remained a mystery Kalian hadn't come close to solving. Randall had shown no interest in the chaos surrounding the Queen's downfall, offering no opinion, no alliance, no visible reaction at all. He simply continued tending his roses as though palace executions happened every season and none of it concerned him. That detachment unsettled Kalian more than open hostility would have. Men who wanted nothing were far harder to predict than men who wanted everything. He hadn't yet learned what Randall was actually capable of. He hadn't yet seen the roses that shouldn't have been able to bloom in winter, roses that had wilted completely one season and returned the next fuller than before, as if something had reached into their dead cells and simply refused to let them stay that way. He hadn't yet noticed how Randall always seemed to know things he had no reasonable way of knowing, including, somehow, the exact nature of the quiet alliance Kalian had built with Planche behind closed doors. That knowledge would come later, in pieces, the way most dangerous truths did in this palace. For now, the kingdom of Kyus entered a season of uneasy peace. The throne stood without a queen for the first time in years. The Brisson family, humiliated and diminished, retreated to their estates to lick their wounds and plan whatever came next. Valcon grew steadily under Ellen's command, drawing talented mages from across the kingdom who had never fit neatly into traditional battalions. And somewhere in a quiet garden within the palace walls, Prince Randall continued watching everything with eyes that gave away nothing at all. King Roma's next birthday arrived nearly a year after the Queen's execution, and with it came a diplomatic caravan the entire court had been anticipating for months. Word had reached the capital weeks earlier that the nation of Tencel intended to send an official delegation, one carrying a name that meant nothing to most of the assembled nobility, but meant everything to Kalian the moment he heard it: Sacriia. The crown heir of the fallen nation Kalian himself had once ruled, in a life this entire empire had helped erase. The heir's name was Chase. Kalian stood among the receiving line of royalty as the caravan wound its way up the palace's main approach, banners bearing an unfamiliar crest snapping in the wind. He hadn't expected the sight of that crest to hit him the way it did, a quiet, unexpected ache settling somewhere beneath his ribs. Sacriia's old symbols had been stripped from every surviving record after its fall. Someone, somewhere, had apparently kept at least one alive. The delegation dismounted with the careful formality expected of a foreign nation addressing its historical enemy, dozens of guards and attendants moving with practiced precision around a young man at the caravan's center, dressed in muted colors that still somehow commanded attention. Chase's eyes swept across the assembled Kyus royalty with polite, distant courtesy, exactly the kind of expression diplomatic training produced in people who'd learned early never to reveal what they actually felt. Then his gaze reached Kalian, and something in his composure faltered. He didn't say anything unusual. He offered the same formal greeting he'd likely rehearsed for every member of the receiving line, words about honored alliances and hopes for continued peace between their nations. But his eyes stayed on Kalian a fraction too long, and beneath the practiced diplomatic mask, something raw and disbelieving flickered across his face for just a moment before he forced it away. He knew. Somehow, impossibly, he already knew. Kalian felt it too, a strange, unspoken recognition passing between them that had nothing to do with formal introductions or royal titles. Whatever remained of Baron's soul inside this borrowed body, Chase seemed to sense it instantly, the way family sometimes recognized each other even after years and impossible distances apart. Neither of them said anything more in that moment. The formal reception demanded composure, and both princes maintained it flawlessly in front of watching courts from two nations with a long, bloody history between them. But something had shifted the instant their eyes met, a thread reconnecting after being severed by an entire lifetime and a war that had ended everything Kalian once knew. That evening, the palace hosted a grand banquet in the visiting delegation's honor, the same great hall where Queen Celis's downfall had unfolded a year earlier, now filled with music, careful diplomacy, and the particular tension of two nations pretending their history didn't sit heavy in the room with them. Kiri had grown restless during formal gatherings like this one, a habit left over from years spent watching for threats in far more dangerous settings. While the main hall buzzed with polite conversation, he slipped out toward the palace gardens to clear his head, expecting nothing more than a quiet walk before returning to his post near Kalian. What he found instead made him stop cold in the shadow of a hedgerow. Prince Randall's personal retinue moved through the garden paths ahead of him, nearly 30 figures dressed in the plain robes of traveling priests, supposedly accompanying some minor religious delegation Randall had quietly invited for the celebration. Kiri had barely registered them earlier in the evening, dismissed as background clergy attending a royal event. Something about the way they moved now caught his attention. Priests didn't walk like that. Priests didn't scan open ground the way soldiers scanned a battlefield, didn't keep their hands positioned the way trained fighters kept their hands near concealed weapons, didn't radiate the particular coiled tension of men prepared for violence at a moment's notice. Kiri had spent enough years around killers to recognize one on sight, and every instinct honed through that experience screamed the same warning now. These weren't priests at all. He moved closer through the shadows, careful to stay hidden, watching the disguised group split quietly into smaller clusters near the garden's edge, positioning themselves with the kind of deliberate spacing that meant coordination, meant planning, meant something far more dangerous than a simple religious escort had any reason to require. His hand drifted slowly toward the hilt of his sword. Chase had been trained since childhood to keep his face perfectly still under any circumstance, a skill drilled into him by tutors who understood that a crown heir's expression could start or prevent a war depending on what it revealed. He had used that training through funerals, through failed negotiations, through the quiet grief of growing up in the shadow of a fallen nation that existed now only in old maps and older grudges. Nothing had prepared him for the moment he looked across a foreign receiving line and felt his dead brother looking back. He sat now at the banquet table, wine untouched in front of him, forcing himself through the motions of polite conversation with a Kyus duke seated to his left. The duke was saying something about trade routes. Chase heard almost none of it. His attention kept drifting 3 seats down, toward a young Kyus prince laughing at something Prince Planche had said, carrying himself with an ease that belonged to someone twice his age. It wasn't the face. Sacriia's royal bloodline and Kyus's shared nothing in common, and this body clearly wasn't Baron's. It was something underneath the face. A weight in the eyes, a particular way of tilting his head slightly before speaking, the same tell Chase remembered from council meetings a lifetime ago, when his older brother used to listen fully before answering, instead of rushing to fill silence the way everyone else did. Chase had been 11 years old when Sacriia fell. He remembered fire more than he remembered faces by now, remembered being carried out through a service tunnel by guards who died getting him to safety, remembered learning weeks later that his brother had died somewhere in the palace, defending ground that no longer mattered by the time the news reached him. He had spent 10 years building a country back out of exile, carrying a crown that felt too large for a boy who'd inherited it in the worst possible way. He had never once let himself imagine his brother might still exist somewhere, in any form. Now he sat in the enemy's own banquet hall, watching that brother's soul wear another man's face, and he had no idea what to do with the feeling climbing up through his chest. It wasn't relief exactly. It wasn't grief either, though grief sat somewhere close to it. It felt more like a wound reopening after 10 years of careful scar tissue, raw and disorienting all at once. He excused himself from the Duke's conversation as gracefully as diplomatic training allowed and stepped toward the hall's edge, needing a moment of air before his composure slipped any further in front of a room full of people who would remember exactly what they saw. He didn't notice, in that moment, that his own personal guard captain had quietly peeled away from the delegation minutes earlier, moving toward the gardens under the polite excuse of checking the perimeter. Kiri had already found what that guard captain was looking for. Crouched low behind the hedgerow, sword hand steady on his hilt, Kiri watched the disguised knights complete their positioning with the kind of discipline that confirmed everything his instincts had already told him. 30 men, spaced with deliberate precision, hands resting near robes that concealed weapons no actual priest would ever carry. He had seen this exact pattern before, in a different life, moments before an ambush. He didn't draw yet. 30 trained knights against one man, even a man with his particular history, wasn't a fight worth starting blind. He needed to know who they answered to before he moved, and more urgently, he needed to know who they were here for. That answer arrived faster than he expected. A man stepped out from among the disguised knights, robes falling open just enough to reveal the insignia stitched into the lining, a small crest Kiri didn't immediately recognize but memorized instantly out of old habit. The man gave a quiet hand signal, and the clusters shifted formation, angling not toward the main banquet hall where Kalian sat, but toward a smaller side pavilion, where the Tencel delegation's personal quarters had been arranged for the evening. They weren't here for Kalian at all. They were here for Chase. Kiri's mind moved fast through the implications. An attack on a foreign crown heir, staged during a state banquet, dressed to look like it came from religious pilgrims rather than a coordinated strike force. If it succeeded, and if the bodies were arranged carefully enough, it could look like exactly the kind of unstable palace security failure that would drag Kyus and Tencel into open conflict within the year. Someone wanted that war badly enough to burn 30 trained men on making it happen. He thought immediately of Randall's Rose Garden, of a prince who claimed no interest in politics while somehow always knowing more than he should. The disguised men had entered through gardens connected directly to Randall's private grounds. That wasn't proof of anything yet, but it wasn't nothing either. Kiri didn't have time to work out the rest of that puzzle. The knights were already moving toward the pavilion, and Chase's guard detail inside numbered barely a dozen against 30 men who'd clearly planned for exactly this moment. He made his decision fast, the way he always had, and drew his sword. The first knight he reached never saw the strike coming, dropping silently before any alarm could sound. Kiri had spent years fighting for his life in an arena that rewarded exactly this kind of brutal efficiency, and none of that instinct had dulled since Kalian bought his freedom. He moved through the garden's shadows like something the disguised knights hadn't accounted for at all, cutting down 2 more before the group's rear guard finally registered that something had gone wrong. Shouting broke out, quiet at first, then less quiet as steel met steel, and the careful silence of their approach shattered completely. Inside the banquet hall, the first faint sounds of struggle reached only a handful of ears sharp enough to notice over the music and conversation. Kalian was one of them. He'd spent enough time now attuned to the particular quality of controlled violence to recognize it instantly, even muffled through stone walls and garden distance. He was moving before he'd fully processed why, cutting through the crowd toward the nearest exit with Soyeon already a step behind him, both of them abandoning formal banquet decorum the instant real danger registered. Ellen noticed the shift in Kalian's posture from across the hall and followed without needing to be told anything. Whatever training Ellen had put himself through as a seventh circle mage who'd spent decades avoiding palace politics hadn't dulled his reflexes either. Within seconds, 3 of Kalian's people were converging on the gardens at once, drawn by instinct toward the exact place Kiri had already committed himself to a fight he couldn't win alone forever. Chase's own guard captain had reached the pavilion just ahead of the main night cluster, buying precious seconds by barricading the entrance with whatever furniture came to hand. It wasn't much of a defense against 30 trained men, but it didn't need to hold long. It only needed to hold until help arrived. Kalian reached the garden path in time to see Kiri fighting 3 knights at once near the pavilion's edge, blood already staining his sleeve from a shallow cut he hadn't had time to notice. Kalian didn't hesitate. An aura blade formed in his hand mid-stride, and he closed the remaining distance in seconds, cutting down the nearest attacker before the man even registered a second combatant had entered the fight. What followed lasted only a few minutes, though it felt considerably longer to everyone caught inside it. Between Kalian's aura strikes, Kiri's brutal efficiency, and Ellen arriving moments later with enough raw magical force to level half the garden if he'd chosen to, the disguised knights found themselves facing exactly the kind of resistance their plan had never accounted for. Several fled the moment the odds shifted. Most didn't get the chance. By the time actual palace guards arrived, alerted by the noise, the fight had already ended. Bodies littered the garden path, most dead, a handful captured and bound under Ellen's watchful restraint spells. Chase emerged from the barricaded pavilion moments later, pale but unharmed, staring at the aftermath with the particular disbelief of someone who'd nearly died at a party meant to celebrate peace between 2 nations. His eyes found Kalian standing amid the wreckage, aura blade still humming faintly in his hand, and something unspoken passed between them again, heavier this time than the polite recognition they'd shared at the formal reception hours earlier. Neither prince said what they were both thinking. Not yet, not in front of guards and captured knights and a garden that would need explaining to 2 entire royal courts by morning. But Chase held Kalian's gaze a moment longer than diplomacy required, and in that look was something closer to a question than a thank you. Are you really him? Kalian gave the smallest nod, barely visible, meant for Chase alone. It was enough. Whatever conversation the 2 of them needed to have, it would happen later, away from watching eyes and formal courts, brother to brother, in whatever strange new shape that relationship now took. The interrogation of the captured knights began that same night, and what little information they gave up under Ellen's questioning pointed toward a shadow organization with no clear allegiance to any single noble house, funded through channels too well hidden to trace back easily. It wasn't Randall. It wasn't the remnants of the Bryson family either, not directly. Someone else, someone patient and well-resourced, had wanted a war between Kyus and Tencel badly enough to spend 30 trained men trying to start one. That mystery would take considerably longer to unravel than anything Kalian had faced so far. For now, though, the immediate crisis had passed. Chase's delegation extended their stay in the capital by several additional weeks, officially to allow security investigations to run their course. Unofficially, because neither prince seemed particularly eager to end a reunion neither of them had ever expected to have. They spoke privately for the first time 2 nights later, in a quiet corner of the palace gardens far from any hedgerow that still bore signs of battle, and Kalian told him everything. The regression, the decade lost and regained, the strange, uncertain shape of a second life built inside an enemy's body. Chase listened without interrupting, the way he always used to, and when Kalian finished, he simply said that he'd known something was different the moment their eyes met at the reception, even before he understood what. It wasn't a full resolution. Too much remained unanswered, about Randall's true nature, about who had funded the attack on Tensel's crown heir, about the deeper mystery of the axis of time that Sisfanian herself had refused to fully explain. Those threads would need their own reckoning eventually. But for the first time since waking up in a stranger's dying body 10 years in the past, Kalian sat across from someone who remembered him, truly remembered him, not as a prince or a regressed soul, but simply as a brother he'd thought he'd lost for good. Whatever came next, war or peace, hidden enemies or old allies rediscovered, he wouldn't be facing it entirely alone.